our website, the brightsign.biz. You can see our URL here in the corner, www.brightsign.biz. We're not a .com, we're a .biz, so there you go when you find us. And we make our software available at no charge. You can find it from our homepage at the Support tab. When you click on Support, you'll see that there are numerous downloadable objects here. And at the top of the page, you'll find the player firmware. Here's firmware for our new model 120, 220, and 1020, version 4.0.13 or 4.1.35. These are player firmware. This is not the BrightAuthor application. And occasionally we'll get a support call from someone who's downloaded player firmware and is having a hard time installing it on their machine, believing that they've downloaded BrightAuthor. And it's not the case. So just scroll down the page, get past the player firmware, and you'll find BrightAuthor available for download. And there's always generally one or two versions there for download. Here I see 3. We have an official release from April 10th of this year. We have a beta release from June 12th of this year. And we've got a beta release from earlier, March. And you'll note that in all cases we show the minimum player firmware version that's required if you're going to use this version of BrightAuthor. And we've got some data about what this new version offers. The 3.2.0.4 is the version that I'm running on my machine. You simply choose Download Now, save that file, and run it. You'll get your typical installer for your Windows machine. We're occasionally asked if BrightAuthor is Macintosh compatible. Unfortunately, it's not, and at present we have no plans to build a Mac version of the application. However, BrightAuthor runs perfectly well on a Mac, but in one of those Windows emulation environments, such as Boot Camp or Parallels. There are several that will allow you to run a PC application on your Mac. And if you've got and are familiar with one of those, feel free to use it. BrightAuthor will run just fine. But download BrightAuthor, the version that is interesting to you. Again, like I say, I'm using 3.2.04 on my machine. Here's the thing to be aware of. And you'll note that we mention firmware versions here that are required. This is the catch. If I go to a version of BrightAuthor, for example, this version 3.2.04, it will be necessary to update my players to the minimum firmware version that is companion to this BrightAuthor. When we release a new version of BrightAuthor, it's generally new features and bug fixes that are supported. Well, in order for those new features and bug fixes to be properly rendered over on the player side, there's almost always a companion player firmware update. So keep in mind that if you update BrightAuthor, you're specifying, or you're also making the decision to update the firmware in your players. If the version of BrightAuthor you're using, along with the version of firmware that you have installed in your players, are all working fine and meet your need, then I recommend staying with that version until there's an actual new feature need to upgrade. Then make a decision to move to a new version of BrightAuthor, realizing that that will also require that you publish new firmware out to your players. Now, the good news is updating the firmware on a player in the field is easily done. It's easily done remotely. There's no need to go visit the player if the player's on a network and you're managing it remotely. But it's something that will certainly have to be done if you update BrightAuthor. So from our main website, go to the Support tab and you'll find these downloads here. Once you've downloaded the BrightAuthor installer, simply run the installer. If you have a prior version, we recommend uninstalling the prior version first before proceeding with the new version. Settings are maintained. You won't lose anything that you've done, but it's good practice to uninstall the old version first before going forward with the install of a new version. All right, I've installed my version of BrightAuthor, and I'm going to move to a volume on my machine here where I have content ready to go for today's session. And before I go too far, what I'd like to show you, we're going to talk now about how to configure a player, and then we'll talk about publishing a presentation for the first time. But a player configuration is on the Tools menu. But before I go there, let's look quickly at the help about BrightAuthor, and you'll see the version that you're running. I'm running version 3.2.0.4. And so if you see differences between how my BrightAuthor looks and yours, those are probably the result of a version difference. The differences would be subtle, but don't be surprised. I need to configure my player for the very first use, and I need to do this really before I build any presentations. We got to get our player up and running and ready to go. And remember, there are two cases where a player might be updated. I'm either updating a player manually and standalone, or I'm updating a player over the network. Well, if I'm updating a player over a network, that implies knowledge about how my network is configured. It also implies getting BrightAuthor properties set up to work in that network environment. Something that's often missed in a BrightAuthor installation is here on the Edit menu, settings and choices about how BrightAuthor will work. Most of these have to do with defaults. The default audio volume, for example, is 100%. Default image is 6 seconds on the timeline with no effect for transition, and so forth. There are a handful of defaults here that you can go through and manage. I like, for example, the clock settings that are available to me. I can choose the language that I want my clock to be displayed in. I can also customize how the clock behaves and looks on the screen. In many parts of the world, we order our date differently. In North America, we have a pattern where we show the month, then the day, then the year. But in other parts of the world, that's done differently. You might want the year first, followed by the month, and then followed by the day. And so you can, by ordering these variables in this field, change how the player displays month and date information. You can also change the language, the actual text that's used when it displays a month or a day. Maybe I am working in Spanish, and I would prefer, rather than July, I would prefer the Spanish word for July, which is Julio, and in which case I simply make the change here to update how the date and the month will be displayed on the screen. So July will be my choice here. I'm going to stick with the North American conventions. The same is true for time. I can choose how time will be displayed, whether I'm using a 24-hour clock or a 12-hour clock, whether I'm going to display AM or PM. So these are available for management within the preferences. The key item here I wanted to get to, though, is the networking tab. Because there are multiple network methods for communicating with the BrightSign player, you can enable or disable those in BrightAuthor. It's helpful to be able to do this because if I don't use a particular method, I can essentially disappear it from the application so that I'm not constantly bothered by it. If I'm publishing via a BrightSign network subscription, there's no reason to be bothered with other networking publishing choices in the dialogues and the screens that later follow in BrightAuthor. So every once in a while we get a call into the support line. I want to use simple file networking, but for some reason it's not showing up on my screen. How do I get to it? Almost always the case is simply a matter of whether or not the option has been enabled here in BrightAuthor. For our call today, I'm going to enable them all so that I can quickly touch on them all. But the reality is you probably use one or another of these. You'll notice some additional tabs appeared here on the screen by virtue of the fact that I had enabled those features. Something else that BrightAuthor does is now that I've enabled work over the BrightSign network, it's offering me an option to sign in to my BrightSign network account. Now, if you're not using the BrightSign network, you won't have an account, and you'd probably go disable that on the settings screen so if you're not given this choice. But I do have one. In fact, I'm going to take a moment and sign into it so that I'll be able to use it later here in our discussion. And sign in. I've now signed into the BrightSign network account. And I know I'm signed in because on the Tools menu, my choice is now Sign Out. whereas before it was sign in, it's now sign out, so I know I am in fact signed in. So our objective is to set up a BrightSign player. For security reasons, a player cannot be communicated with over a network until it's set up. You simply cannot plug a player into the network and just expect to find it. That would be a security breach and a security problem. So you need to configure a player for first use on the network. Now, once it's configured and working, you'll be able to manage it remotely in every respect. But until you've configured it for that very first use, you won't be able to find the player, publish anything to it, or use it really at all. Setting up a player is a choice from the Tools menu called Set Up a BrightSign Unit. And making that choice brings this screen forward, and you'll see here the configuration choices that are available to me. You can give the player a name and a description. The name and description are entirely up to you. You can choose the time zone for the player. A player that is connected to the network knows what time it is. And it's important for a player to know what time it is because we give you the ability to schedule presentations to run on a certain date and time. Occasionally someone will call and ask why their player is not showing content. The screen is always dark even though they've scheduled something to run today. Why isn't it running? And often the answer is simply the player has no network connection. The player doesn't know what time it is, and therefore the player cannot follow a schedule. Seems simple here when we talk about it, but the reality is we get more than a handful of calls on this subject. So choosing a time zone and choosing a time server. You're free to use ours, time.brightsignetwork.com, and it's the default time server for a BrightSign player, but it's not required that you use ours. You could enter somebody else's time server or your own if you use one, but ours is available. Now, to see our time server, you'll need an internet connection. Obviously, our time server is not installed on your network. So if your player does not, maybe your player is connected to your local area network, but is unable to see the big wide world of the public internet, your player still will not know what time it is unless you point it to a local time server. And that's a case where your local IT folks, again, can tell you what time server they want you to use. But by default, a BrightSign player is going to try to connect to the BrightSign time server, and worldwide all BrightSign players know what time it is. This section on the screen has to do with setting up an IP address. As we talked before, you can either get your IP address automatically, which follows the DHCP protocol we discussed earlier, or you can enter an IP address manually, in which case your IT personnel will give you the information that you need to place in these fields. I've entered an IP address here, as you can see, 192.168.1.2, a subnet mask, a default gateway, and a broadcast IP address. But these will not work, almost certainly not work on your network. You'll need to coordinate with your IT folks what settings should go in these fields. Let's set line for automatic. If you're on a Wi-Fi system, then you have the option to choose wireless, in which case you need to put in advance here the SSID, which is the broadcast name of your wireless address, and the security key. But or if you're just going with a physical connection, choose wired, and this all disappears. Here's where I have the option to specify a firmware update. Remember our discussion about firmware, that it's necessary to have a minimum version of firmware installed given the version of BrightAuthor you're running, and I can include that firmware as part of my player setup. Now I don't ever have to worry about it again. I've updated my player, it's running the right firmware, and I'm ready to go. So on the old models, the 110, 210, and so forth, you choose the firmware for that player, or if you're running one of the new players, the 120, 220, 1020, you can choose that firmware and say OK. When you choose to update firmware, you'll get a little asterisk down here by specify firmware update, just as a visual cue that a firmware update has been selected. Otherwise, you can choose not to update firmware, and those asterisks will disappear. So with a firmware update selected, remember now, having updated firmware, I won't need to do that again. Players don't forget their firmware. It's just something you do once. I now have the option to set up my player for the networking method that I'm going to use.